Imagine your doctor prescribing a medication for a nagging pain, a medication presented as a safe, modern solution. You take it, trusting the system. But what if that pill was engineered with a dark secret? Not just to dull your pain, but to hook you, to make you a permanent paying patient. You'd expect the architects of such a scheme to be infamous, their names synonymous with betrayal. Yet, history shows us the opposite. The most successful architects of mass addiction are often laundered into respectability. Their crimes buried under plaques bearing their names on libraries, hospitals, and museums. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a recurring playbook, a cycle of ruin and rehabilitation that is played out across centuries and continents. Today, we're pulling back the gilded curtain on this eternal con. We're tracing a line from the poppy fields of colonial India to the pill mills of modern America, exposing the shocking parallel stories of two families, the Sassoons and the Sacklers, who mastered the dark art of profiting from human suffering and walked away as pillars of society. Their story is a masterclass in how money launders memory and a terrifying warning that the same game is still being played, right now, with our health and our lives. Our journey begins not in a corporate boardroom, but on the high seas of the early 19th century, at the dawn of what we might call the first globalization drug crisis. The British Empire had an obsession and a problem. The obsession was Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. The problem was that China, a confident and self-sufficient empire under the Qing dynasty, had absolutely no interest in British wool, clocks, or other manufactured goods. They demanded payment in one thing only: silver. This created a catastrophic trade deficit. By the 1820s, Britain was hemorrhaging millions of pounds sterling worth of silver annually into China. A literal drain of national wealth that economists and statesmen saw as an existential threat to the empire's power. Britain's solution was not to innovate or negotiate, but to weaponize addiction. They turned their colonial crown jewel, India, into a narcotics factory. Through the East India Company, corporate entity so powerful it commanded its own private army and governed territory. They licensed farmers, often forcing them to grow poppies instead of food. Processed the raw opium in vast state-run factories in Patna and Benares, and packed it into standardized chests for auction. This was not a rogue operation. It was calculated imperial policy. By the 1830s, opium revenue funded roughly 14% of British India's entire budget. Roads, railways, colonial salaries, the infrastructure of empire was literally built on drug money. The mission was coldly clear: flood China with opium, create millions of addicts. And watch as the silver that flowed out for tea would come rushing back in to feed the addiction. It was economic warfare waged with narcotics. Into this system of state-sponsored trafficking stepped David Sassoon, a Baghdadi Jew fleeing persecution. He arrived in Bombay in 1832 with little capital, but immense cultural capital, a deep network of trade contacts across the Middle East and Asia, and a sharp understanding of how to navigate imperial power structures. David Sassoon was no common smuggler. He was a logistical and financial visionary. He saw the British opium machine not as a moral catastrophe, but as the ultimate business opportunity. But his genius wasn't in breaking the system, it was in perfecting it. The Sassoons built the world's first vertically integrated, multinational narcotics corporation. They didn't just buy opium at auction, they controlled it from seed to pipe. They provided loans to Indian farmers to bind them to poppy cultivation. They owned the warehouses in Bombay where the chests were stored. They built and operated their own fleet of sleek, fast ships, the opium clippers, to transport the cargo to China. They even founded the Sassoon and Alliance Insurance Company to underwrite the shipments, keeping every rupee of risk and profit within their empire. In China, they employed a network of compradors and agents who spoke the local dialects, navigated complex bureaucracies, and distributed the drug deep into the interior. They were the indispensable, efficient, and utterly reliable middlemen for the British Empire's dirty work. By the 1850s, the House of Sassoon was shipping tens of thousands of chests annually, a significant portion of the total trade, reaping profits that were almost unimaginable. They had turned the opium trade into a sleek corporate enterprise. The human devastation in China was biblical. Port cities like Canton and Shanghai became hubs of addiction. Productivity collapsed. Families sold their children for opium money. The Chinese state, its social fabric unraveling and its silver reserves evaporating, finally took a stand. In 1839, Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed over 1,400 tons of British opium. In a famous letter to Queen Victoria, he posed a piercing moral question. Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. Certainly, your honorable ruler would deeply hate it and be bitterly aroused. Britain's response was not diplomacy, but cannon fire. The First Opium War was a brutal mismatch of technology and might, ending with the Treaty of Nanjing, which forced China to pay reparations for the destroyed opium, opened 5 treaty ports, and ceded Hong Kong. A second war, even more devastating, culminated in 1860 with British and French troops looting and burning the emperor's old summer palace. A cultural atrocity. The final treaties didn't just tolerate opium, they explicitly legalized it. The Sassoon Empire, built on circumventing laws, was now shielded by them. Their fortune was secure, built on the shattered lives of millions. This is where Chapter 2 of the playbook commenced, the Great Laundering. The Sassoons understood that vast wealth invites scrutiny, but vast philanthropy buys silence and sanctity. They embarked on a breathtaking campaign to rebrand themselves from drug lords into enlightened benefactors. In Bombay, they became the city's foremost patrons. They built the David Sassoon Library and Reading Room, a Gothic revival jewel. They funded the Sassoon Docks, a massive engineering project that became the lifeblood of the city's commerce. They endowed schools, hospitals, orphanages, and synagogues, providing essential services where the colonial government often failed. To the burgeoning city, the name Sassoon meant progress, charity, and civic pride. The British establishment, grateful for their loyal service in enriching the empire, showered them with honors. David's son, Abdullah, who anglicized his name to Albert, was knighted and made a baronet. He became the first Jew to be granted the freedom of the City of London, an honor that had not even been bestowed upon the Rothschilds. The Sassoons were welcomed into the highest echelons of British society, marrying into the aristocracy and hosting royalty. The source of their wealthy addiction, ruin, and wars in China was effectively erased from public memory in the West. They had executed the perfect heist, stealing the health of one nation to buy the respect of another. Their name, carved into the stone of Mumbai's most beloved institutions, became a monument, not to their crimes, but to their calculated generosity. Fast forward a century, the Sassoon Empire crumbled, undone by the rise of Chinese nationalism, world wars, and shifting global trade. Their name faded from headlines, a curious footnote in history books. But the playbook they helped write did not gather dust. It was merely awaiting a new caste, a new medical product, and a new vulnerable market. Late 20th century America, enter the Sackler family. Like the Sassoons, they were outsiders seeking a path to immense wealth and social standing. Arthur Sackler, the patriarch, was a medical advertising genius who pioneered the direct marketing of pharmaceuticals to doctors in the 1950s and 60s. He understood that medicine was not just science, it was a story sold to physicians. His brothers, Mortimer and Raymond, took this ethos and applied it to a company they purchased in 1952. Purdue Frederick, a modest maker of laxatives and earwax remover, the stage was set for a repeat of the opium crisis, but with a lab-coated, legalized twist. In the 1990s, pain was a vastly undertreated market from a corporate perspective. Doctors, wary of the addictive potential of strong opioids, reserved them largely for cancer and in Dove Life Care. Purdue Pharma, the company run by Raymond and Mortimer's branch of the family, saw an opportunity with a new drug, OxyContin, a slow-release version of the potent opioid oxycodone. Their strategy mirrored the colonial exploitation of a trade imbalance. But here, the imbalance was between legitimate pain and corporate greed. The cornerstone of their campaign was a fraudulent, the scientifically baseless claim that OxyContin's slow-release formulation made it less addictive. They seized on a single, carefully negotiated phrase in the FDA label. Delayed absorption, as provided by OxyContin's formulation, is believed to reduce the abuse liability and turned it into a gospel of safety. They unleashed a tsunami of marketing, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. They funded pain management seminars and independent advocacy groups that pushed the narrative of a pain epidemic that only aggressive opioid prescribing could solve. They deployed an army of sales representatives, incentivized with bonuses, to target general practitioners in regions with high rates of manual labor and injury. Convincing them that OxyContin was safe for common back pain and arthritis, internal documents later revealed a callous, Sassoon-like focus on market domination. Sales reps were told not to niche the drug for cancer, but to go after the massive, lifelong chronic pain market. One marketing official infamously described it as a responsible way to push the drug. They tracked patient starter sheets like stock tickers and celebrated when doctors prescribed higher dosages. When early reports of addiction and abuse surfaced, the company's strategy, as revealed in litigation, was to blame the abusers, discredit the reports, and continue pushing for higher volume. They created a demand where cautious need had existed, and then fed that demand with a product they knew was dangerously addictive. The result was a public health catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Since 1999, over 500,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses, with prescription pills like OxyContin serving as the gateway for countless addictions that later turned to heroin and fentanyl. Communities were eviscerated, a national trauma that unfolded in plain sight, and just as the Sassoons had done, the Sacklers moved swiftly to the reputation laundering phase. As billions flowed in from OxyContin, the family became arguably the world's most prolific philanthropists in the arts and sciences. The Sackler name adorned wings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, and the British Museum, galleries at the Smithsonian, and the Guggenheim Institutes at Oxford, Harvard, and Yale, and medical schools and research centers across the globe. They cultivated an image as enlightened, cultured Medici, using the soft power of art and the noble pursuit of science to scrub their name clean. For decades, it worked brilliantly. Attending a gallery at the Sackler wing conveyed no sense of contradiction. It spoke only of refinement and generosity. But the modern world, with its relentless connectivity and activist energy, finally forced a divergence in the script. The reckoning for the Sacklers did not take a century. It unfolded in real time. The dam began to break, with investigative reporting, state attorney general lawsuits, and the powerful activism of groups like PAIN, Prescription Addiction Intervention. Now, led by artist and former addict Nan Goldin, Goldin staged dramatic die-in protests at the very museums that bore the Sackler name, forcing a public moral confrontation. One by one, the cultural world turned. The Met, the Louvre, the Guggenheim, the Tate, Harvard, Oxford announced they would refuse future Sackler donations and remove the family name from their walls. It was a stunning, coordinated act of social excommunication, a revocation of the respectability they had paid so dearly to acquire. The legal and financial reckoning has been more complex, a murky saga of bankruptcy law and contested settlements. Purdue Pharma pled guilty to federal criminal charges for its fraudulent marketing, not once, but twice in 2007 and 2020, paying billions in fines that were dwarfed by the profits already extracted. In 2019, the company, besieged by thousands of lawsuits, filed for bankruptcy. The proposed settlement has been a legal and ethical quagmire. A key outrage was the revelation that the Sacklers had withdrawn over $10 billion from Purdue in the decade before the bankruptcy, funneling much of it into offshore trusts, a modern version of the Sassoons' diversified global holdings. After years of litigation, a bankruptcy plan was confirmed, granting the Sacklers permanent immunity from future civil opioid lawsuits in exchange for a contribution of up to $6 billion to a national settlement fund. For many victims' families, it was a bitter pill: vital funds for addiction treatment and prevention, purchased at the price of forever forfeiting the right to hold the individuals accountable in a courtroom. As one commentator noted, the family was very far from bankrupt, having preserved a significant portion of their global wealth. And crucially, their international business empire, Big Pharma, continues to operate in over 120 countries, selling opioids and other drugs. Reports indicate that even after the U.S. bankruptcy, parts of this network remained highly profitable, suggesting the family's financial fortress, built on a global scale, remains largely intact. They are not ruined. They are restructured. So, what is the terrifying, enduring lesson of this 200-year spanning echo? It is that the system, the economic and political systems, perversely hospitable to these empires of addiction. First, it reveals that respectability is a currency that can be bought, and history is written by the donors. The Sassoon Library still stands as a beloved Mumbai landmark. The Sackler Galleries, though being renamed, housed some of humanity's greatest art. These are tangible, positive legacies, but they act as psychological shields, making it profoundly difficult for society to hold a full, clear picture of the architects. We are culturally conditioned to separate the evil of the crime from the good of the charity, when in fact, the latter is the direct product and purposeful sanitizer of the former. Second, it shows that state or systemic complicity is not a bug, it's a feature. The Sassoons had the full might of the British Empire, its laws, and its navy. The Sacklers operated within a broken American healthcare system, a captured regulatory agency, the FDA, that approved the misleading label, a pain management paradigm they helped create, a distribution system that turned a blind eye to suspicious orders, and a legal framework that favors corporate settlement over personal liability. In both cases, the empires thrived not by defying the system, but by expertly manipulating its levers of power and loopholes. Third, and most critically, the playbook persists because the business model is too profitable to die. We now live in a medical-industrial complex that financially rewards the management of chronic conditions over cures. The shift from acute, treatable illnesses to lifelong pharmaceutical regimens for pain, anxiety, depression, high cholesterol, and more has created a perfect ecosystem for the Sassoon-Sackler model. Identify a widespread human experience, pain, sadness, stress, medicalize it. Market a solution that requires perpetual use, downplay the risks of dependency, and leverage professional authority to distribute it. The methods are more sophisticated, the marketing more subtle, but the core mechanics are unchanged. Create reliance, ensure repeat customers, and monetize human vulnerability. The Sassoons are ghosts in the marble of Mumbai. The Sacklers are being scrubbed from our museums, but they are not the last. The next dynasty is already being formed. They are not in shadowy opium dens or rogue pharmacies. They are in Silicon Valley biotech startups, in private equity firms that buy up pharmaceutical patents, in the marketing firms that sell us on new digital health solutions. They are being celebrated as innovators and disruptors, and somewhere in their portfolio is a drug, an app, a genetic therapy, or a diagnostic protocol that creates long-term dependency financial. The con, refined over 2 centuries, remains the same. Identify a vulnerability, be it a nation's trade deficit or a person's chronic pain. Offer a potent, alluring solution. Capture the market by any means necessary, leveraging authority and obscuring risk. When the bodies and broken lives inevitably pile up, deny, deflect, and deploy an army of lawyers. Finally, use a fraction of the profits to buy the ultimate commodities: legacy, respectability, and a rewritten history. Time, the great accomplice, then does the rest, sanding down the rough edges of atrocity until all that remains is a name on a building, a story of success, and a forgotten graveyard. We've now seen the playbook performed twice on a global stage with devastating consequences. The final urgent question for USA's patients, citizens, and consumers is this: now that we can read the script, will we have the courage to stand up and stop the next performance before the curtain rises? Will we learn to see the philanthropy not as a redemption, but as the final calculated move in a game of human exploitation? The answer will determine what and who we choose to memorialize in the century to come. Let us know in the comments, can this cycle ever be broken, or is the profit from pain simply too seductive a force? If you want to dive deeper into the hidden systems that shape our world, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. The truth is often buried, but it's never too late to dig.